A Manhattan Project for AI. Does America need it? And what should it be? To discuss, we have on Lennart Heim, information scientist at the RAND Corporation, and Chris Miller of Chipwar. In this episode, we're going to discuss how to measure who's ahead and behind in AI with respect to China and the rest of the world, and what, if anything, the US government should do about it.
So we recorded this episode last week, but over the weekend, OpenAI dropped a new model, o3, which blew away expectations on the pace of progress. Miles Brundage, formerly of OpenAI, wrote that AI that exceeds human performance in nearly every cognitive domain is almost certain to be built and deployed in the next few years. Jack Clark of Anthropic agrees, writing that basically no one is pricing in just how drastic the progress will be from here. This makes our conversation at the start of this episode about the geopolitical implications of scaling test time compute all the more important. And stick around to the end of the show for some o3 specific takes Lennart recorded over the week.
Lennart, Chris, welcome back to ChinaTalk.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for the invitation.
We're going to start with algorithms. Lennart, what's your take on what DeepSeek's models do and don't mean for US-China AI competition? Maybe more broadly, like what does scaling on inference mean for export controls?
I think it's to some degree, but maybe many were like took by surprise. Because basically what we've seen over happening this year is that the gap between, again, these US models and these Chinese models has been closing down a tiny bit. Again, it always depends how you measure it. We always look at these benchmarks. That's the best way of going about this. If this is a success metric, that's another thing we can maybe talk about later. I think it's wrong now to basically say, oh, that's the reason why export controls do not work. DeepSeek now has a model that's as good as OpenAI's model or like nearly as good. Therefore, all of these export controls were futile. Was actually the wrong thing to do. Mainly wrong for two reasons. I think the first reason is we only have export controls. They started in 2022 on these AI chips. Unfortunately, the initial parameters roughly got it wrong. So NVIDIA created the H800 and H800, which are as good as the US chips. So we lost basically a year until they were patched in October 2023. Well, what did DeepSeek do? Again, according to, at least now they have 20,000 A100s, which I got access to before the export controls. And there's also rumors they've got a bunch of H800s. Again, these chips are pretty good. You bought them a couple of years ago. They're still like not the best chip you can currently get access to, but yeah, one of the better chips you can get access to. Therefore, they have tons of them. Therefore, they will remain competitive for the foreseeable future here. And I think the other point here is like, it's not like doing export control stops people from training these systems immediately, right? Like one should rather think about one has a broader impact on the quantity of AI chips they have access to. So will someone be able to get access to sufficient AI chips to train a competitive AI system? Probably, yes, as of right now for this generation. If, assuming like scaling continues, we need for pre-training 1 million, 100,000 chips, then we should see this gap to widen. But if we look at these current systems where we talk about like 20,000 chips or something along these lines, and then these export controls are basically only existing for what? A little bit more than a year now, we should not expect like an immediate impact on the pre-training year. Where we maybe can see an impact if they want to deploy it. So this would be an interesting question, right? What if all Chinese users now start talking to these systems? Do they have sufficient compute to deploy these systems at scale? In particular, if you now do this inference scaling.
Let's underline like how O1 and inference scaling has the potential to be like exponentially more demanding on what you need from a compute perspective.
So what we do with O1, again, we need a system which we trained before. Again, probably tons of chips, so like a really good pre-trained system. But now we've got like a new method to squeeze more juice out of an existing system. So probably doing some reinforcement learning and making it really good as reasoning. What does reasoning mean here? The model just produces more outputs, more tokens. What does more tokens producing outputs mean here? We need more compute to run it. Now what you're saying is like we let the model think. It's now running for 10 seconds on these GPUs. So now what you're saying this is if I now query model somewhere, the GPUs are crunching numbers for 10 seconds where nobody else can use this model right now. Whereas in before, let's just assume it was just 1 second. This means every user could now potentially have like way bigger compute use. Again, and this compute, these GPU resources need to be coming from somewhere. And this makes a big impact, right? Like, so not everybody is like right now could like query these models. You probably do not have sufficient compute resources for doing it. What exactly the needs are, we don't know yet, right? Maybe if they open source it, we have like better insights here. And then one could make estimates here on what the total compute resources would actually be.
But do you think it's fair to say this is a bit of a, I don't know, a shift is the right word, but maybe a bit of a shift in the rationale for export controls? That if, when we recorded a podcast 2 years ago on ChinaTalk, we were thinking, I think, primarily in terms of training models. And now we're still talking about that for sure, but we're also talking about inference as a driver of progress in a way we probably weren't thinking about it 2 years ago. What does that imply for kind of how you think about properly calibrating export controls going forward?
I think it's a new paradigm, but it's not like a replacing paradigm. Like it basically coexists here. We've got at least evidence that like the early ways of reasoning was like chain of thought. We just asked the model, think step by step, and turned out it performed better. What we saw there, bigger models had better chain of thought, so they performed better over time. So like we still continued pre-training and asked them still to do this chain of thought. I expect a similar trend here. Bigger model potentially can do better reasoning. Maybe we're at a ceiling there somewhere. That's to be discussed. So like in general, I think as we've seen with many technologies, for example, semiconductor industry being a similar example here, is like we have an overarching trend here, but like we have different paradigms enabling this, right? And we have different ways how we created transistors. The overarching thing that they got smaller over time is still roughly true, right? So new paradigm emerging here. Does it fundamentally challenge export controls? I don't necessarily think so. Again, as long as pre-training is still true, and now for deployment is still being the case, this still means compute is important here. It could have been the other way around. Let's just imagine we would have found a paradigm which like turns out we get like just better capabilities by new architecture, by like something which doesn't require compute and the deployment compute is the same. This would have undermined our export controls a little bit more than before, right? But I think in general we should like, turns out the picture is more complicated than bigger systems lead to better performances, therefore you need millions of chips. Turns out it's a bit more complicated. This is still a little bit true, but now it's also true for deployment. But then we still have this ongoing question. You can always think about thinking more. Then it also depends on how many users you deploy to. So again, a more complex ecosystem, which we generally should have expected with the AI ecosystem maturing to happen over time. And again, if this trend continues, this eventually might challenge export controls completely, because if compute is not this key determinant, which impacts capabilities here, this would then challenge the efficacy of export controls here. But I think many, many parameters need to change. And again, generally we see this slowly changing over time, and then one should reassess if this is the best way of going about it.
Yeah, so let me just underline that. So what inference and O1 and DeepSeek's new model have shown is that if you let the model, after you train it, once I ask the model a question, instead of giving you a response in 2 seconds, it can take 3 minutes, it can take 10 minutes, it might even take an hour. And the time that the model is, literally thinking, that is using compute that, if it was in a sort of older architecture, circa 2022, 2023, it would have just spit out an answer. That answer, like the longer one that you're thinking on is, it's doing it for a reason to give you a better answer, more accurate, more thoughtful, what have you. But that having 1,000 users all ask a question that takes an hour versus having 1,000 users all ask a question that takes half a second to respond makes it more likely, at least for now, that countries are going to be needing far more compute than they would have in a different paradigm to get the most out of AI from a productivity, national defense, whatever perspective. So inference scaling or models thinking longer is for now a complete argument in favor of export controls and sort of compute prowess more generally being something that nations are going to need to take seriously if they want to really excel in this technology.
Indeed, and I think that's also like a broader interesting point here, which is like us differentiate between like training and deployment so clearly. It will just like get more fuzzy over time. These things will look more similar. Like already right now, we use systems which we already trained to create synthetic data, to give feedback, to train the new system, right? So this line will just continue blowing going forward. I think if you also just look at like early AI developments, if you look at AlphaGo, AlphaZero, we had like this component of self-play, right? Like we had this thing playing against itself. Is this not deployment? Is this training? Well, it's both things happening at the same time. And I expect we will see like more of these trends with large language models, AI agents, whatever things are going to be happening next year. And again, they then do undermine this. The distinction gets like a little bit harder here. Compute will continue hitting. There is a case which needs to be acknowledged here is to now get capability level X. Let's just say we want to measure a benchmark here. You potentially need less compute. I cannot train a smaller system, do the fancy reinforcement learning, and have the model thinking let's just say for this I only needed 100 GPU hours, whereas before I needed 500 GPU hours because I found something more compute efficient, right?
Yep.
So like we found a new compute efficiency multiplier. This is nothing new. This is what we're doing all of the time, right? So there's like more efficiency over time, and it gets cheaper to get to a given capability over time. I think it's just hard to frame a national security conversation around just like, here's the capability which we're worried about, and this is the thing we're trying to manage here. It's just simply true that any given capability will get easier to access over time. This is just reality we need to deal with.
Yeah.
Is it generally true that the sort of the contours of the national security argument around export controls are also shifting a bit, given the focus on inference infrastructure and test time compute? In that, if it was all about training, you could say we don't want them to train this type of thing. But if it's actually about do you have the infrastructure to run a model a million times to get a million different use cases from it, it actually ends up being a bit more about productivity and a bit less about kind of a discrete national security use case. It does seem like that is also shifting a bit.
Yeah, it depends. Again, like I think the reasoning with an export controls is like mostly 1 or 2 pages. We already see 2022 that didn't really talk about frontier AI. 2023 they did talk about it, and this year with the revised export controls, which I think Jordan you just covered recently, they talked about it a little bit more. Interestingly, the revised export controls control high bandwidth memory, HBM units. HBM is key for AI chips. Why is it so important? It's particularly key for deployment, actually. Right? I probably don't need the most advanced HBM generation. My workloads are generally like less memory intensive for training versus for deployment, right? Because I need to look up all of the attention mechanisms for these kinds of things. So like one could argue, actually, banning HBM, stopping Huawei and others from equipping AI accelerators with HBM is having a bigger impact on deployment or than training, right? If this is an explicit motivation, I don't think they state this in the document.
Let's do a little semiconductor history argument for you, and maybe we'll have Chris restate it if I get it wrong. So the idea is there's this big argument in the 80s and 90s on RISC versus CISC. And Pat Gelsinger pushes x86 as the dominant architecture, basically saying that like software is not going to need to be that efficient because the hardware is going to kind of like keep growing exponentially, that like you don't need to have the cleanest code because like the Moore's law is going to sort of clean it up for you. My sense is that there are enough AI engineers thinking up creative ways to use compute that like the amount of algorithmic innovations is going to expand to sort of fit the compute that is available for the engineers at Anthropic and DeepMind and OpenAI to play with. First, curious if you guys agree with that broadly, if that is like the trend we should expect.
Yeah, I think that's right. That if we have compute sitting around, we will find ways to make use of it. I think an economist would ask, what's the marginal benefit that comes for an additional unit of compute? And so we'd want as much algorithmic bang for your buck out of each unit of compute that you're using. Now, I guess I've been struck by, at least the last couple of years, the fact that there are still shortages of GPUs in certain segments of the market means that we clearly have a very strong economic output for every GPU we put in, or at least that's the investment we're making. But whether that persists over the long run, I think is a different question, and is far from guaranteed. We know Moore's law has had this historical trajectory. It's much harder to estimate improvements to algorithmic efficiency, although people have tried. But there's no reason to think those, I think, follow a steady trend, linear or otherwise. And so I'd be pretty agnostic about where that will go projecting into the future.
There is still a thing, even if you get like better compute efficiency over time. And like, again, there's many people who've been trying to estimate these kinds of things. And again, it's generally really hard to put a number on it, but one can try. There's still a question, how are they being found? Is this just like me showering in the morning and I have a beautiful idea and I suddenly save 10x compute? Or is it me actually running 100 different experiments, like more experimental setups, like trying to validate these ideas, scaling it up? And a lot of times you might also only have like these compute efficiency ideas happening by doing the big experiments. Or you're going even further. I get this beautiful idea from my new GPT-o1 model, right? Because it helps me. So I think these kinds of things generally get more fuzzy. It's definitely true if you talk to any engineer at the leading AI companies, there is an internal competition around who gets the most compute, right? Like clearly, this is like always an ongoing debate. how much compute do you get for your research projects? And like with no AI being commercialized, there's like even more competition, because it turns out every single time you give your researchers more compute, it's less for the deployment, right? I would generally be interested what these load graphs look like, right? Do I run my experiments during the night when less people use ChatGPT? Again, I think most people are not vocal about this, but that's the kind of thing you would do when you have like a resource which you can allocate here.
To Chris's point, as long as this stuff makes money, and as long as each unit of intelligence there are like, returns to, which I think is like a pretty reasonable assumption to make, is that like the smarter these things get, the more value you can derive out of them. Like it's I'm at least like pretty comfortable expecting that like at least into the medium term, there's still going to be a lot of demand for this stuff across lots of different sectors of the economy. So then, coming to China, right? If export controls are working and TSMC isn't allowed to just like make as many chips as they want for Huawei, which I guess we'll get to later, and the Chinese cloud and AI development ecosystem is just stuck with like 1/3 the amount of capacity to develop and deploy algorithms. Like, what does that mean for the research directions that engineers in the PRC are likely to take?
I have two things that struck me this year. So number one was there were some data points suggesting that rental prices for GPUs in China were lower than in the US, which is not what you'd expect in a GPU-constrained environment, which is interesting. Whether it means that they're, one interpretation is they're not GPU constrained. Another interpretation is that there's actually just like much lower demand than you'd expect. And I think it's worth thinking about the relevance of that answer. I guess I've also been struck, second data point is if you look at most Chinese big tech firms, ByteDance excluded, I think, but Alibaba, Tencent, and Baidu, and then chart their capital expenditures from ChatGPT to present, you don't find anything like the steady increase in CapEx that you get when you do the same chart of US big tech firms, which means that they're not going all in on AI infrastructure in the way the US big tech firms are. And, I think there's a couple of reasons why. One, are they afraid that their chatbots are going to say something mean about Xi Jinping? Maybe. Two, are they less convinced that there's a market for their products? Maybe that. Three, are they all reeling still from the kind of political crackdown they faced in 2019, 2020? And so investing billions of dollars doesn't seem smart. Maybe that's also relevant, but it does seem to be striking how differently the Chinese big tech firms are responding to AI relative to US big tech firms. And I do wonder what that tells us more generally about compute demand in China going forward.
Mm-hmm. And I think, correct me, John, I think you also recently covered just like the VC ecosystem in China, which is like a big difference, right? I think like the sprawling thing in the US is like this VC ecosystem, having this risk capital to actually explore these kinds of ideas. This becomes increasingly important if you're building data centers in the billions, trying to reactivate nuclear power plants again. You just need this money.
Yeah, I mean,
to move forward.
There's less money to go around, and I think in this DeepSeek interview I translated recently, like investing tens of billions of dollars into like cloud infrastructure and for training these models, which like it's not like immediately obvious how you're going to be able to make a ton of money on them, is not something that tech in China has spent a lot of time doing. And there have been sort of like big loss leader type things in more hardware oriented sectors of the economy, but less so in a software driven one. And I think that may also be like a bit of a sort of like investor cultural sort of like business mindset shift that a place like DeepSeek, because they're not like trained in the like Alibaba, Meituan, Tencent universe of people, have been able to look at this from a longer horizon and set themselves up more like a research organization, which like none of these places are. We'll see. I don't know to what extent like small incumbents who like have enough capital to put their money when their mouth is when it comes to algorithmic innovation can keep going. Or, we can get to the point where stuff starts getting stolen. So, Lennart, what are your latest securing model weights and algorithmic IP takes going into 2025?
Yeah, I mean, that's the point which I would have brought up, because like we were just saying like, oh, if you have less compute, you probably have like less algorithmic insights, right? You slow down the ecosystem. If there would only be a neat way around it, well, then of course there is. So I'm like referring to like a grand RAND report here. I think it's called Securing Model Weights by my colleagues. The general notion here being is, well, we just talked about you need like these 10,000 of GPUs to train a system, but turns out of it you get like a file. It's a couple of gigabytes, terabytes big. Well, if you just have this file, and again, some people just openly release this, you're gonna get access to like, right? Like it allows you to like constrain or just like go around having all of these GPUs. And that's definitely worrisome, right? So generally, therefore, big calls to secure these AI labs, to secure the model weights. But importantly, what we just talked about here, there are these compute multipliers, right? They're like new ideas. And we've seen many new ideas over time. Transformers were a new idea, which just got published. And this is like, right now, we diffuse this idea widely. I think it's fair to say this changed, like roughly 2 years ago. You don't see that many papers coming out of OpenAI, DeepMind, or Anthropic anymore where they talk about the architecture. Since GPT-4, they have not released the architecture. And if you want to know what the architecture looks like, I think you mostly got to go to the right parties in San Francisco and be lucky. And then you might be able to get these insights from, which is exactly the problem here. You can get insights to these algorithmic secrets to some degree, kind of steal them, and then just carry them over and have like new ideas. This basically allows me, if I go to the right party in San Francisco, talk to the right person, I get like, let's just call it a 5x compute multiplier, compute efficiency multiplier out of it. I go home and say like, hey guys, I saved you 10,000 GPUs, right? So those are the kinds of things which are really, really important to secure. So we've seen the labs taking it more secure by not publishing. But also, I think we need to go beyond. I think right now they're mostly acting like a normal corporate environment. You don't share your secrets anymore. But if we see AI as a core to the national security and these leading models becoming more and more important, these AI labs need to be secure against like actors from states, potentially trying to, again, steal these model weights or steal the secrets. Both of them are like potentially like easy to steal with like current infrastructure, because defending against nation states is really, really hard. So the general thing we've been like thinking about, and I think what eventually should happen, which is like these companies need help from the US government, but they also need to step up the game on their own to, again, secure against state-sponsored actors, because this completely undermines all of export controls and everything else we've just been talking about.
So I have two questions, Leonard, if I can. So one is, how do we know we're striking the right balance between securing important IP and having the types of free exchanges of ideas that disseminate across different companies and drive technological progress and economic growth? What's the metric by which you sort of assess the how to strike the right balance there? Let me start with that one.
I think right now we live in the worst of both worlds. It's not like OpenAI or DeepMind goes around here and shares their research with like researchers, right? Or like puts it on archive or puts it on like goes to Neurops or ISML and says like, look guys, here's how we do it. They diffuse it all around the world and everybody can do it. Well, that's not happening right now. They're keeping it close to themselves with proprietary information which they do not share. But on the other side, you can get access to this information potentially by hacking. So you don't have the diffusion in the US, and you have immediately the diffusion to your adversary or whoever hacks or like whoever gets access to this information without the appropriate means here. So this is clearly not what we want, right? That's the worst of both worlds. On the other side, clearly we want like an open ecosystem for many other things. Like that's the reason why people still release open sourcing model weights and all of the infrastructure around it, which also pushes the whole US ecosystem basically forward, right? And how to strike the balance here, I think this would like be way too big to cover here. There are many reports talking about how to balance open sourcing and all of these other things there. But again, on the AI labs right now, I think it's a pretty clear strike right now. We do the worst of both worlds, right? We don't share it with the US, but we give it to the people who want to steal it.
Let me put a counter argument there. Developing algorithmic innovations for frontier AI models is not something that happens, is not something yet that is done in a factory. And clearly, like the places that have been most successful at it are the ones that have a special research culture and that are able to attract talent from all around the world, including China, where 40% of all papers or some really striking number of top students every year are either from China or like Chinese nationals who do their advanced degrees abroad. And the problem is I think when you start thinking of a sort of like classified skunkworks-y model, you get downsides from two dimensions. So first, from the talent perspective, it becomes more and more difficult to have people doing the cutting edge research in your organization have access to everything and have the sorts of backgrounds that would get you into trouble when it comes to having a security clearance. And then I think broadly, the way that research in like super classified settings happens is not with 1,000 people sort of all exchanging ideas over Slack. It's much more, compartmentalized and securitized, and the sort of benefits. Lennart, you were talking about the benefits from like a global perspective of understanding that. I mean, let's drive down one level to the benefits within your firm of like just the company itself. If there are sort of walls up when it comes to information sharing and, okay, whose experiment is better than the other one and who, how can I learn from my colleague and who gets more or less compute? All of that just gets worse the more sort of barriers you put into internal company interaction, which is like basically what you're calling for in this. And, the solution that the Manhattan Project had was like, okay, like, sure, we can have everyone from all around the world, but we're going to put them in the desert and not let them leave for 5 years until we develop an atomic bomb, which is like, I don't think something that's going to happen to OpenAI or Anthropic anytime soon. So I see what you're saying, but I do think there are underappreciated downsides and like the magic that has allowed the Western labs to flourish, which is something that DeepSeek and very few other Chinese players have like really internalized, is that open sort of like internal firm level like scientific interaction, which putting too much like traditional national 21st century style scientific national security brakes on could really slow down what the firms can get up to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm not going to make up a story here where I say like security doesn't come at any cost here, right? And as we were just saying, it's important where you just put the walls. We have existing walls, we call them companies, right? Maybe just reinforcing these walls, but within these walls, again, you have like this open flourishing environment here. I think this basically gets you a lot, but just reinforcing these walls would be pretty good. And again, the further you go, and you were naming the Manhattan Project, yes, like eventually, again, if somebody at some point says like this research can only happen in a classified environment, I think this comes at research speed. But that's just a trade-off again, which at some point somebody will decide on where it will fall. But I think for right now, if you just look at the leading AI labs, there might be a couple of things which are like fairly low cost, where you just like can maintain the speed while just like continue being a little bit more secure. So I think we're not at this level yet. I think like if one looks at the RAND report, we have like these different security levels here. One can just basically say the higher the security level here, the higher the costs here are. And also many things don't come at any efficiency cost here. Some things come at a bigger efficiency cost. So one could just first go for the low-hanging fruits here, which will potentially help a lot.
My two clever ideas are, if we believe in the future of export controls and a world in which, the world ex-China has like 3x or 4x more compute than China going forward. It would be interesting for, I don't know, the labs or the National Science Foundation to be incentivizing research around the types of sort of like technological development trees that the US is more likely to have a sustaining advantages in compared to China going forward. Because you look, Salt Typhoon, right? Like the Chinese government has been able to listen to any phone call they wanted to for no cost at all. It seems to me like kind of implausible. Like, yes, maybe you can make it harder, but like I don't trust any sort of security organization period in like keeping their secrets from China. So kind of banking on that as like one of the things you're really going to be confident in going forward on having an edge in a sort of emerging technology competition with a strategic competitor seems like a poor thing to base your strategy on.
Well, I think this also gets to an interesting question of, how should we think about algorithmic improvements? Are they a recipe that can be straightforwardly copied, or are they embedded in a bunch of tacit knowledge that's actually hard to replicate even if you've got the blueprints? And I actually don't know what the answer is, but that seems also like a really important key to kind of assessing to what extent you'd want to take a step towards security.
I mean, we can draw a beautiful connection here to the semiconductor industry, right? And I think we're aware of many IP thefts from ASML. The guys in the Netherlands are building the most advanced machine to build the chips. And I don't think it's sufficient to just get the blueprints here, right? And I think we've heard like these other stories from like various people who cover semiconductors, like, oh yeah, you learn from the elder. When you get there, they teach you how to use this machine. You got these test runs, right? There's like a lot of this tested knowledge here. I do think that's a general argument, which I would probably make here. I think this is probably more true for the semiconductor industry than it is for the AI industry, given that the AI industry is just like way younger, right? The thing which I've been thinking about recently, which again, I had thoughts here, just like, are there more low-hanging fruits and like new paradigms? So we've now done this pre-training, we scaled up a bunch of models like over time, and I think it's harder to find new ideas there. Whereas like now we have like this new paradigm, which like we continue like run in parallel, which is like this test time compute. Is it now easier to find low-hanging fruits there? And I think so, probably. Like I expect like a bunch of academics, DeepSeek and others to find like a bunch of new ideas there. Because it's just a new paradigm, people are playing around with it, and I think we will just find like over the next year a bunch of new, like again, algorithmic insights which help us to like squeeze more capabilities out of these AI models. And then it will probably just get harder over time. Maybe the progress stays the same because we just throw more money at it, right? But that's like all TBD, and generally an empirical question which we can learn about. We'll see.
All right, so on that, Lennart, what does it really mean to be compute constrained?
Yeah. I mean, I've been thinking more about it like from the view of export controls, right? And I was initially debating this idea of just like thinking you do export controls yesterday and tomorrow they cannot train a leading AI model anymore. I think it's like not wrong. So like, what is a good concept to think about like the impact of export controls? I think there is a quantity and a quality argument. So the quality argument is more just like, well, if you cut them off from having access to extreme ultraviolet photography, the ASML machines that cannot produce the most advanced AI chips. So their chip is now stuck on 7 nanometer instead of like, whereas like TSMC produces 3 nanometer. So that's a quality argument, right? You can still produce an AI chip, but AI chip is worse. It got like less flops, less power you can squeeze out of it. The good thing about exponential yields, sometimes exponentially less you can squeeze out of it. It's not like the chip's 10% better. A lot of times these chips are like 4x, 5x, 6x better. That's generally like the underlying technology trend, which plays in favor of export controls. The more the exponential is going, the quicker the gap widens. But the other argument is a quantity argument here. So we all know chip smuggling is a thing, it's going on, they still get access to some chips, but of course it's significantly harder, right? So like what you definitely see is the export controls are having an impact on the quantity of AI chips they get access to via smuggling, but also what they can produce via the semiconductor manufacturing equipment controls. And this touches upon the point we said before. It's like, well, then you're basically compute constrained. They have less flops available than everyone else. So what does this mean? And the thing which I've been like trying to embrace more over time is more like an ecosystem view. Instead of saying like, oh yeah, they will not be able to train GPT-5 or something. I think it's like, well, who knows? Maybe. Who knows what even GPT-5 is? But will definitely be true. It will be harder for them. Why will this be harder? Well, we just talked about it. If you have less compute, you run less experiments. Less experiments means less insights. But I think what's also interesting is when you have less compute, you have less users you can deploy to, right? If suddenly everybody wants to use it and I'm compute constrained, I can only give it to 1 million people instead of 10 million people. That makes a big difference. This makes a big difference for learning, I think, partially. Like how people are using your models, maybe you train on their data again. But it also makes a difference on like how much money you make, right? If I'm deploying to way less money, I'm less interested to VCs. Well, if I make less money, I buy less chip the next time, and my next training run will be smaller, right? So what I generally think is like this quantity argument, where I think export controls are actually hitting hard, is it's just like increasing over time because they really don't get the flywheel spinning if you hit them at the right point, right? The flywheel spinning in that sense is like, well, you don't have like a lot of experiments, you deploy less, so you make less money out of it. And then more importantly, when these models are not getting really, really good at helping your engineers doing AI R&D, so basically your AI model becomes now your, like the person you employ who's now doing AI R&D. And how many people do you employ? How many AI agents do you have? It's purely a function of how much compute you have. If I have 10x more compute than you, I have 10x more people working for me, basically, right? And like all of these things make me roughly just like, yeah, man, like this quantity thing is like really important. It's like actually one of the main impacts how like the AI ecosystem in China is getting hobbled by these kinds of things.
So I think
that's like mostly unappreciated, like in a lot of discussions.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think the Chinese government response, and Jordan, you tell me if this makes sense, this is my theory, is that just like they don't care about consumption in the economy, they only care about investment, so too they only care about AI, not in the consumer sense, but only in the sense that it contributes to productive forces. And so they're going to talk about robotics, they're going to talk about AI for industry. And the Chinese government sort of hopes if you can take your limited compute, but deploy it all in the quote unquote productive direction, you're going to get the types of returns you're looking to get from it. And I think the problem with this theory is that actually like a lot of the learning from AI systems is going to come in consumer applications or in kind of like boring enterprise applications. Unless you get that whole ecosystem, you're sort of standing on a one-legged stool that's not going to make the type of progress you're looking to make. Does that sound right, Jordan?
Chris, it's interesting because that both doesn't seem wrong and is also like it's like that is an argument in strategy. That is an argument you make and a strategy you take if you are sort of compute or like broadly resource constrained, which I think is like, clear that it's the case.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think also there's a sort of political aspect to it in China, which is that in addition to being, at least right now, somewhat compute constrained, she's also spent the last 5 years beating up on the companies that ought to have been leading this revolution in China. And so getting back to where we were previously, your willingness to invest in a consumer-facing AI product is just meaningfully reduced relative to 5 years ago, because if you succeed, you might end up in the political spotlight.
Yeah, I think there's many good bits here. Just like part of it is also like I was just saying, like how much money you make determines how big your next model is. It's not definitely true. Like to some degree, you can just like if OpenAI builds a good model, you can partially also piggyback on top of this. Where it's like, look, AI is cool. There's way more VC money now in it, right? And then you can just say, well, state subsidies in the PRC are significantly bigger. They can just build it whenever, right? Like they don't need to get any revenue going for these kinds of things. I think this challenges my idea a little bit. Then I think the points you guys touched upon is like, well, other applications, there's tons of AI stuff here. Where like, I talk about AI agents, O1, there's like way more around the world again, which is like not that compute heavy, right? And again, tying this back to NetSec, that's a question here. Like, what exactly is the thing one is worried about here? If I'm talking about this here, I'm to some degree pointing to what everybody just calls AGI. Like this is artificial general intelligence, this AI agents, which can do everything, right? I think this is sometimes a slightly bit different. They still will be able to like deploy it, and they're deploying it at scale. I think computer vision, the PRC, is leading in many domains, right? The question is like, what about this other domain? Let's just call it AGI. And when will different risks emerge there, and how much compute will you need them is an open, ongoing question. And I think you cannot get a guarantee for it's definitely going to work. It just depends where will things emerge, and for some things it will work, for some things it won't, right? The more compute heavy it will be, the better it will work. That's the story you can tell here, but how compute heavy it will be is an ongoing empirical question.
I think the other obvious implication of being compute constrained is that you can't export computing infrastructure. And perhaps that's a good segue to the Middle East.
I think part of the compute constraint story, in addition, is also, as we were just saying, you cannot also export a bunch of chips if you all need them for your own internal supply here. And this gets into interesting questions here, because if the PRC is like barely able to meet the domestic demand, assuming this is true, right? We don't right now have this evidence. We know for sure that the US and its allies producing way more AI chips. You can also export AI chips. And this is an ongoing debate, where and how should AI chips being exported on these topics. And we know that we already have existing export controls, which cover country group D5, the PRC and more, and Russia and other countries. But we also have countries which require an export license and approval before, and that's country group D4, which covers the UAE and Saudi Arabia, which are, having increasingly bigger AI ambitions. And I think like since the beginning of this year, the US government was like basically dealing with this question, like, should we give them chips, and under which conditions should we give them chips? Because the beautiful thing about licenses is you can ask for a bunch of things like, here are the conditions for your license, and then you can give them AI chips here. And again, I think it's clearly the case, if the US has more AI chips and the better AI chips, well, they're for sure interested in these AI chips. And this is now an ongoing debate, again, which I think hasn't settled yet. And we will see over the coming year where, again, also the incoming administration will fall on this topic on who should get AI chips, if at all, under which conditions, or should we just like get rid and the UAE can get as much as they want.
When I think it's been publicly reported that the rules that might be coming soon from the U.S. government envision, at least in part, using U.S. cloud providers or data center operators as sort of gateways to getting access to certain volumes of AI chips. So you've sort of got private companies giving a sort of seal of approval of sorts on the use of AI chips in this category of countries.
And I think that's eventually an interest, right? That's like a win-win situation where you basically say, look, you get AI chips, but we give you our cloud provider with it. So you basically have Microsoft to basically guide you or like safeguard you from like whatever kind of threats you're worried about here. And I think what's important to understand here is people think about export controls, they think about missiles, weapons, whatever. Sure, wherever the weapon is like in final charge of this weapon, right? They can use it or cannot use it. This is not necessarily true for cloud computing, for compute, right? AI chips can be an arbitrary country. You can dial in remotely and then do whatever you want here. So if I'm a country which is compute constrained because I'm export controlled, I cannot export AI chips, what would I do? Well, of course, I would start using cloud computing elsewhere or even start building data centers elsewhere using a shell company or whatever, build my data centers there and then just dial in remotely. It's not that any AI engineer, like I bet most AI engineers have never seen a cluster they actually train their systems on, right? They're like sitting somewhere wherever you have the electricity. So, and this is like I think a key challenge here, right? It's like there's this layer challenge, like first, where are the chips? Then the second question is like, who is using the chips? Even if you know where they are, you don't know who's using them. And then actually there's a third challenge here. Even if you know who's using them, you don't really know what they're going to be doing with the artifacts. They could theoretically just train a model, they can train AGI and just give it to whomever. Goes back to the securing model weights discussion. And then again, US cloud providers, I think, are your helper here because they help you with the second layer. Because they sell the compute and they can verify and vet whoever is using the compute here. And I think that's a fairly easy challenge. I covered this before in papers where we talk about know your customer regimes. We've got a whole paper dedicated to it, which is called Governing Through the Cloud, which I wrote at my time at the Center for the Governance of AI. We'll just talk about that these cloud providers technically can oversee this. Because who are we worried about here? We're only worried about people accessing tens of thousands of chips for a long time here. Then you potentially want to vet a little bit deeper here. And I would honestly trust a US company doing this more than any other, than just a random company in the Middle East doing this kind of vet.
There's broad agreement that if I say I'm going to build an AI cluster for nefarious purposes, I shouldn't be allowed to build it. I think there's another step that the regulations appear to be going in, which is to say, we don't know what the future uses of AI capabilities will be. And countries might tell us one thing, but we can't really trust them over time. And therefore, we want a dominant position in most of the world's AI infrastructure so that we can both set out regulations today, but also have the ability to set out regulations down the road. And I think that's something that makes some people uncomfortable, that sort of assertion of we want us and our friends to kind of have this position of power in the long run, because otherwise there's no way of enforcing any sort of rules or regulations in the long run.
I think it's fair criticism. I would give it like more of a positive spin here, right? It's more just like, look, we both decide what responsible AI development means, depending where you fall on the geopolitical spectrum. We have a little bit more ask and a little bit more questions here, and we just really want to be safe for these kinds of things. Notably, like exporting chips is still, you export chips, you still could go to the other extremes, like you only get access to compute via cloud computing, right? If there's like somebody saying like, I really want that many compute, which is like, look, you can just dial in remotely, you can buy it right now, why do you want it in your country? But again, realistically speaking, this doesn't work for countries, right? They want some type of, let's just call it sovereign AI. They have certain data center protection laws and more. So I think eventually you want to go out there, expand, diffuse AI technology, right? Diffuse AI chips, but also notably diffuse the cloud provider and their infrastructure around it.
Yeah, and this gets to like the saddest story I've read of 2024 is the American Battlefield Trust coming out against data centers being built next to Manassas, which is kind of like just like really hitting me from both sides because, ooh, do I want those data centers? But no, I want to keep those Civil War battlefields too. But anyways, speaking of like sovereignty when it comes to AI, one level up is being able to control the supply of chips. And kind of what happened to Intel, there are different spins with Pat Gelsinger getting fired and the board saying that product, not foundry, is the most important thing for this firm going forward. I think there are a number of different interpretations on like to what extent this is a big deal for the future of Western national competitiveness in AI. Chris, what was your initial take on the news?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is a big deal, and it certainly does imply that there's a big strategy shift underway at Intel. The question is, what strategy shift? I think there's a path whereby Intel sells some of its design businesses and doubles down on being a foundry. There's a path where it does the opposite. And then there's a third path where they just keep trying to muddle through and make it until 14A. They can prove whether the new manufacturing works. But regardless of the path, it seems like all of these are options you wouldn't want to have to take relative to where expectations were 2 years ago. And I think, if you're sitting in the new administration that's going to come to office in January, they're going to face a tough set of questions around, you've already promised, I think $6 billion, $8 billion to Intel via the CHIPS Act. That is dependent on building out a lot of expensive manufacturing capacity that Intel may or may not need. And any sort of path forward, I think many people assume only works with a whole lot of more capital from both the private sector, but also from the public sector. And so I think Intel will be a really tough case for the next administration to think about, in addition to the management team and the board, which have a lot of thinking of their own to do.
It comes back to the fundamental pitch that Pat made at the beginning of the CHIPS Act, is like, America should have leading edge foundry capacity in the US. And on the one hand, like, this is a global industry, like, the world's screwed if Taiwan gets invaded regardless. Like, TSMC is nominal, like Taiwan is a treaty ally, and TSMC really shouldn't be doing things to piss off the U.S. government, like sell leading edge chips to Huawei, because where the Washington at the end of the day is the guarantor for Taiwan's continued like existence as it's currently formulated. But the question is, like, yes, it would be a better world state for America to have Intel be a sort of a real second supplier, or the best maker, the best global foundry in the world. But like, how much would you be willing? How much would you be willing to pay for that? And B, even if you do pony up another $50 billion, $100 billion, like, you're not necessarily, it's not really only money that's the problem here. Like, you need to deal with these idiots on the board. You need to deal with this culture problem. Like, there are a whole lot of, business like implementation challenges, which, is like one of the hardest challenges in all of business, is to compete with some, that basically almost pretty much every other company in the world that was in this space has given up on over the past 20 years because it's been too hard. So I don't know, Chris, do you want to put a dollar amount? Like, how much would you be willing to have your taxes go up in order for there to be a U.S. owned leading edge foundry?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right that it's not only about money. I think it is, though, partly about money, in the sense that money gives Intel the time that everyone agrees it will need. Whether Intel succeeds or fails, I don't know. But if Intel only has 12 months, it's going to fail, right? They need 24, 36 months to really prove whether the processes work or not. And so money is one of the inputs into how much time they actually have. I think the other variable that matters is TSMC. Which of course has their first Arizona plant up and running in early production. They publicly said yields there are as good as comparable processes in Taiwan. That's no small thing, especially given all the negative publicity around TSMC the last couple of years in their Arizona plant. And they're building a second plant and promised to build a third. And I think one could imagine that more might be in the future. And so I think the other aspect is that the better TSMC and Arizona is doing, and the more production is there, then the less you ought to be willing to pay to have an alternative, because your alternative is being built. Now, the big question is, what's the number of, I think for AI, what's the number of GPUs being manufactured in Arizona? Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that remains to be determined over the next couple of years, whether you get substantial GPU production actually happening in Arizona, because TSMC has said publicly 99% of the world's AI accelerators are produced by them. And the only places that can happen are either in Taiwan or potentially in Arizona.
I think there's been at least public reporting NVIDIA's planning to produce in the US in the near future. So that'd be great. But it's a broader question, like producing the logic dice is one thing. What about the HBM? What about the packaging? Where will these kinds of things happen? Right? There's a question here for the CHIPS Act now, where it's just like, should you strategically carve out, like, to get like all of the things onshore for this AI chip? Is this a strategic priority? Or are we just okay with AI chips without HBM? Just in the worst case.
So on Intel, they've gotten CHIPS Act money, which is dependent on them building out new manufacturing capacity, which the new leadership team might well decide should not be built, which raises the question of, is there chips money that has been allocated to these new facilities, if they're not built, what should happen with it? And so to see Intel as having already received the money is not right. They've got promises of financial help if they build out a ton of new manufacturing capacity, which I think is, again, the decision that's going to land on the Trump administration's inbox early on.
The exercise should be done of, okay, we give, America's foundry $25 billion. That gives them a 30% chance of competing with TSMC on a one-to-one basis in 2028. If we give them $50 billion, what does it look like? If we give them $75 billion, what does it look like? And like, whatever however high you go on the U.S. investment in the capital, like, you're probably not getting a higher percentage than, I don't know, 60, right? So it's this fascinating kind of like unknown where clearly like the sort of rationale was good enough in this very unique moment of the chip shortage and COVID and whatever, and a Democratic controlled House and a White House to get $52 billion. But that was spread over a lot of things, which was not necessarily just directed on frontier chip manufacturing. But like the table stakes to raise, I don't know, if we give Intel, like, let's say a 10% chance of making it all work with this like crap board and, no PAT anymore, to be, roughly in line with Intel, roughly in line with Intel come 2028, like, being able to tell a compelling story of moving those numbers up by, real double-digit percentages is going to be the challenge of, the next CEO, the next Commerce Secretary, who Perplexity told me has never said anything public about semiconductors before, whoever is going to run the CHIPS Act, if the Biden CHIPS Act people end up leaving. I mean, these are like very difficult and pressing questions that the Trump administration should be thinking about already, and like time is really of the essence. But as you said, look, if it doesn't work out and you're sort of stuck with TSMC, then you got to still deal with this really weird awkwardness of them having made a ton of chips for Huawei. I think we need to hit on this story a little harder. What was going on over there?
What a great segue. I think the story, when did it hit? It's been more 1 or 2 months ago. I mean, the primary here is export controls. How do export controls work? Well, if the Chinese entities could just go to TSMC and now produce the best AI chips, this would undermine all of it, right? So there's controls that they simply cannot go to TSMC and produce the best AI chips there using the most advanced nodes. There are 2 rules. There's one rule. If you're on the entity list, you can't do this, which Huawei notably is. There's a second rule. You cannot produce an AI chip above a certain threshold, right? And then I think at some point the story broke. The Tech Insights did a teardown of the Huawei ASUN 910B, which is one of the leading AI data center chips being produced by Huawei, was probably produced by TSMC at the 7 nanometer. And, well, this is breaking 2 rules. It's breaking the entity rule list and it's breaking the AI chip rule list. I kind of get, like shell companies and these kinds of things, how they set it up. Sometimes gets a bit tricky, at least with the current information we have. I think one could have detected this. What's even worse here, right? Again, like setting entities, where is this eventually going? That's like all really tricky to some extent. But like if you're TSMC and you're producing an AI chip and you see a die, which is massive, we're talking about 600 square millimeters. It's like, I don't know, like 5 or 6 times the size what you usually have like on a smartphone. You should become a bit suspicious, basically. That's my take, right? And I think that there's been like some reporting where like somebody said, I thought it's just a crypto accelerator. And again, any engineer can tell the difference here. So there's probably some structural issues here at TSMC where just like the legal compliance team doesn't talk to the engineers. And notably, if you design a chip,
or the business people told the compliance team, hey,
I don't want to make any accusations. That's what you're here for.
Okay.
But on the other side is like the design teams. It's not like you send them something and then you stop talking, you get your chip. This is a co-design process, right? You start experiment, like, you get your first tape out, like your test chip, you see how it's going, you tweak some parameters. So like there was clearly an ongoing communication on these kinds of things. But then they produced the logic dies for the ASUN 910B, at least for the teardowns we've seen. It's still an open question if now all of these chips were produced always at TSMC. If some of them were still produced at SMIC, again, I haven't seen a public teardown of 910B from SMIC. So again, it's a bad story, which we can tell here is like TSMC producing for Huawei. It definitely undermines export controls. A good story you can spin here is like, what's going on with SMIC? why don't you use SMIC to produce your AI chips, right? Is this like some signs of like SMIC production issues happening here? Or maybe both things are happening at the same time. Definitely more insights are required here.
Speaking of shell companies, what on earth was the US intelligence community doing? The fact that they needed to get this from Tech Insights? I mean, like I can't imagine there are too many things higher priority than understanding where Huawei is making their chips. And for this to be something that like you get broken through Tech Insights and Reuters just seems to me to be like a sort of absurd series of events and like a giant gaping hole in what the US is doing and trying to understand what.
And we had it before with Ramondo doing the visit and then the Huawei phone piece, right? I think that, again, there could always be more. There's definitely more required here. And I think I can just motivate the IC and everyone else to do research here. But even if it's not the IC here, even think tankers, nonprofits, if they don't do it, you can do it eventually, right? So like one can just do this research. You can just get Google Maps out there and just try to find the fabs or whatever. You can do a lot with open source research. People can just go on the Chinese eBay and see how many H100s they're selling. There is tons to do. If there's, well, it's not a market failure, but let's call it a government failure here, where again, nonprofits and others can help here to provide the information here. And I think this gap is bigger than I thought. For sure.
I think it also speaks to the challenges of economically related intelligence collection, which is certainly something the U.S. is challenged with. But I also think it's interesting to ask, what is the MSS in China gathering about technological advances in other countries, and what conclusions are they drawing? Because if we're struggling with it, which I think it's fair to say that we are, I wonder what is in the briefing landing on President Xi's desk, and what do they say about semiconductors and AI, and to what extent does it actually line up with reality?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the solution is just to give money to ChinaTalk, but we'll get there. I don't know about the whole MSS thing. I mean, look, it's on the one hand, there were a number of papers, I think from CSET that maybe in like 2021, 2022, I'll link in the show notes, that did this very sort of holistic overview of like all these different like organs of the Chinese system that do this like international technology, horizon scanning, forecasting, whatever. But like whenever there are DOJ indictments of these people doing it, it seems like really lame and like grubby and kind of pathetic.
Totally.
Of like, yeah, they're just like trying to fill their quotas and like not doing that a great job. So I don't know. I'm kind of look, I don't have a clearance. I don't actually know what's going on, but I'm sort of two minds of. I think on the one hand, if the U.S. government is so bad at figuring out what the Huawei chips are, maybe the Chinese are also terrible at figuring out OpenAI secrets. Like this could just be like bureaucracies can't pay for good talent or have bad incentives, and that just means that they're not good at executing at things, particularly in fields where the opportunities for people to do the work in the private sector are just like orders of magnitude more exciting from a sort of compensation and lifestyle, whatever perspective. So that might be what we're looking at in a sort of mirroring fashion, both in the U.S. and China.
That seems right, but I think there's something broader here, which is like I'm a techie, right? Like I did electrical engineering. I'm entering this policy world, and it's been quite a journey. I think we all learn at some point. There are no adults in the room, but it's increasing over time. And I think it's like something similar here, where just like on tech issues, there's like not a lot of people who just like can really grasp it, right? Like we're entering this new AI domain, we enter the semiconductor domain. These things are highly technical. You need technical experts, right? And to get them to government, again, you're competing with way bigger salaries now. It's not about hiring international foreign experts or whatever. It's about like hiring people who've done these kinds of things to understand the tech inside out, to even be aware of tracking this, right? I actually used to use something which is like an interview question. If you would be Chinese, how would you circumvent the export controls here? And I think surprisingly little people mention cloud. I was like, oh yeah, because they just always think physical product, the physical location matters the most. But it's like, no, it's compute. That's the thing you eventually care about here. It's not about having the H100 in your room. So there's like some type of things which are just like, I don't know, like maybe it's like technical brains which think differently about these kinds of things, where we just need like way more brains in DC, be it in the think tank space, be it in government, be it in the IC, getting more people activated on these kinds of stuff. And we're just early days with these export controls. I think it gets better every single day with like more technical people looking at it. But we're clearly not there yet. And I think, you've covered a bunch of hiccups over time, and many of them can be explained by just a lack of technical knowledge and a lack of capacity to deal with these kinds of things.
Okay, so we have to diffuse like technical talent into government, but we also have to diffuse AI into the broader economy. Lennart, take it from there.
Diffusion is a big topic. I think I was briefly touching upon it when we talked about where should data centers being built, like, Microsoft going abroad. I think this is like a type of diffusion. Maybe another way of putting it is we talked a lot about protect here, export controls. What about promote? These things should eventually go hand in hand. There are many reasons you can diffuse, just being good for the world. There's also another reason to diffuse, just like to potentially counter alternative PRC AI ecosystems, right? You would rather have, America-led AI chips, data centers, and AI being built around the world. So that's an angle of diffusion which I've recently been thinking about. And then posing as a question to you guys is like, well, then we see the gap between models closing to some extent, right? China's catching up, everybody's building a small model, they're getting better and better. So like I increasingly believe that like models are not the mode anymore. And this is important from a diffusion perspective here, because potentially if you want to diffuse, particularly from a NetSec perspective, you want to have something which is sticky. Are models really that sticky? Like even GitHub recently, like GitHub has like Codex, which helps you like to write code. They used OpenAI before, but they also now use Claude from Anthropic. I was like, oh, that's interesting. They're just like literally like ditched Anthropic and said like, oh, we can just like change like the API call here, and suddenly we have a different one there. So like even Microsoft is basically acknowledging like maybe models are not the mode, and well, there are some hiccups with OpenAI in the past. We want to diversify here, which you also see in other moves. So long story short, if models are not the mode, what do you want to diffuse? What is sticky? How should one go about this? And what are the different benefits of sticky here? And again, me mostly thinking about this from a NetSec perspective.
Yeah, I think the interesting dynamic is to ask, what are the business models that are sticky? Like if you'd asked me 20 years ago, what's the likelihood we have 3 cloud providers with global scale and no one else can compete outside of China and a little bit in Southeast Asia, I would have said, I guess there's economies of scale, but I wouldn't have guessed that there's this extraordinary stickiness in these business models that has given them such extraordinary heft. And I think no one knows the answer is what will be the business models in AI that will be that's sticky, where the moats will be deep, where the economies of scale will be large. But I think that's the other relevant question to start thinking through, because those are assets that you want in your country and not in other countries, because that will give you enduring sources of potential influence. And we'll see how AI is actually monetized. But I think that's a space worth watching closely.
Yeah, and I think the thing which is struck me is just like maybe want to build on top of existing infrastructure. Like there are many organizations around the world that use Microsoft Word. Some love it, some hate it, but it turns out it's surprisingly sticky for some reasons. I've rarely seen companies trying to change it. I think there was a big debate in the British government at some point. I actually still don't know where they at. So it means like it's like somewhat sticky. It's like really hard to get rid of it. So is it about like the Copilot in Word, which then calls which model? Like, is this the sticky infrastructure we're talking about here? Is it a development infrastructure? So there's like, yeah, I think more thoughts to be done here, because again, we've been covering a lot of this protect angle here. We've been not thinking a lot about this promote angle, diffusion angle on these kinds of things. And this relates then to like, what are the sticky infrastructures and how do you win the AI ecosystem? And not only how do you have the models which perform best on the benchmarks. I think this is to some degree the shiny thing on Twitter and elsewhere, but I think eventually should go beyond that. That's where I haven't seen a lot of work yet. I think we need potentially more.
Yeah, and it does, getting back to the question in the Middle East, it does push in the opposite direction of our discussion of export controls, because if economies of scale really do matter, then you want to make sure your companies are reaping those economies of scale as soon as possible, which means expanding globally, not just in the U.S. And you could debate what exactly does that imply for export controls. Does it still mean that you want control of the infrastructure? Maybe it does. But I think balancing the control dynamic next to the making sure you're capitalizing where economies of scale do matter is an important balance to be struck.
What about smartphones? Like we all talk about AI all day, but like which AI using a smartphone seems to be a fairly big deal here. If you just think of like Apple is now starting to use OpenAI for some, but also developing their own. I expect at some point they will ditch them, right? interesting enough, Apple is also ditching NVIDIA for a bunch of things. Apple just builds their own AI. It becomes the de facto AI on all MacBooks, on all smartphones. This is like, just suddenly you have like millions of users immediately, right? And I think there's like not a lot of attention to these kinds of things. Like, how do you eventually get it to the users here? And I think maybe next year we're entering like more of this domain of like more consumer applications which go beyond chatbot. And then we can see if it's actually being useful. I haven't heard anyone yet being really impressed by the new Apple Intelligence update and actually using it a lot. I think it's mostly quite the opposite. So will this change next year? And then like, if this Apple login is true, is this the way like how we decide who wins in AI and not? Yeah, that's like a recent thing on.
Let me take this from a slightly different angle. So like, I think at the end of the day, AI matters because it will drive productivity growth. And that is like, so that is the thing we should be optimizing for. Like, I have a tremendous amount of faith that, you know, Apple and the VC ecosystem and Google and OpenAI and whatever are going to be able to continue to come up with model improvements. Like, NVIDIA will continue to like create better chips, and we'll figure out like interesting ways to use them. Where I am sort of worried is that the breakers in the system for people being able to reap that productivity benefits are going to come in the form of regulatory barriers to diffusion. So, you know, the teachers union saying that we can't have AI in the classroom, like the doctor saying we can't have AI in the operating, you know, on the operating table or what have you. Every sort of technological revolution is going to bring workplace displacement. And I think it's fair to say that at the other side of every technological, you know, every industrial revolution we've had over human history, like humans have been left better off and more productive and like satisfied with their lives than they were, you know, before the steam engine or before the computer, or when we still had before Excel or whatever. So I think the next, you know, few years are going to be particularly interesting for the sort of political economy fights of the consumers, of the, you know, of the sort of new entrants or the firms that are being aggressive in trying to deploy this technology against the sort of labor forces that may be more or less organized based on industry that are likely to feel threatened by this, and will start to sort of push back, particularly on a regulatory perspective, and allowing AI to, change how they sort of purvey their goods.
Yep, totally agree. And I think there's this sort of firm versus labor dynamic, which totally agree on that. There's also an incumbent firm versus new firm dynamic, which I think will be equally important depending on which industry you're looking at. And then there's a question of, so who's better placed there, US or China? And I could make an argument on both sides in different industries. I'm not sure there's an obvious kind of question whose political economy is better suited to harness rather than obstruct innovation.
Well, if we just talk about, like, let's do Trump for 1 second. On the one hand, like he's scared of things, like he's scared of what happens to the S&P, but I think he's also scared of unemployment. But he's probably more scared, and he's scared of inflation. But he's decided, I don't know, he's like tweeting in favor of like no automation at ports, and I don't know, it's like a big mess, and probably is just going to come out a wash, and they won't end up doing a lot because like they don't want to make regulations, or I don't know. What's your take on where Trump is on this, Chris?
Well, I guess my take would be that, you know, Trump is probably 5% of the decision making. The other 95% is diffused throughout all sorts of standard setting organizations and local school boards and other parts of society that will be more determinative in aggregate. And that's where the culture matters, because the culture will shape decision making around this and in all these other kind of diffuse organizations. And I do worry a bit that like all of the discussion about kind of the downside risks of AI safety plus the possibility of massive job loss have made AI seem like something more frightening than it should be seen. Like, obviously those are things to take seriously, but I also want that weighed against the benefits of technological progress. And I guess I do have a sense that the culture discussion of AI has been too negative over the last couple of years, and that might shape these diffuse debates.
Yeah. And I think just my China take is like, she's, as if not more scared of unemployment than Trump is. But I think there is sort of like a level of like, sure, whatever, we'll try anything in a lot of different parts of the particularly non-SOE driven Chinese economy that may be even more suited to sort of adjusting the way workflows happen than the US system, where like things are pretty good, or like good enough for a lot of people. Like I think the Chinese education system, the Chinese healthcare system is so obviously deficient that I feel like there would be more of a this is sort of like where China was in 1978 in your book, Chris, where like it was like things were so broken that like Deng was willing to like be much more aggressive than Gorbachev was. I mean, maybe America with its like sort of like legalistic, bourgeois, like things are, $65,000 GDP per capita is like too complacent to get through the trough of dislocation that's going to come on your way to, AI enlightenment. So we teased this at the beginning. Like, what are we putting in our AI Manhattan Project?
Well, so I think Manhattan Project is like not really the right way to think about it. That was a secret undertaking, time delimited, very focused. Whereas what we want actually is diffusion over decades. And so I would sort of think about like, what are the things that we did that won the technology race with the Soviets over from the 1950s to the 1980s, of investing in R&D across the board, of making sure incentives are properly aligned, of breaking barriers to innovation when they happen. And I worry that Manhattan Project makes it seem like too much of a one-off rather than this sort of society-wide progress of both inventing and then disseminating AI.
Yeah. I probably have more quirks of the idea of Manhattan Project, or just like a full-blown Apollo projects to build AGI. Because I was just like, what exactly are we building? What exactly is the end goal here? Is it AGI? Can we like better define it? And then exactly what? If you do these kinds of things. So it's an ongoing question for me. But what it needs, I mean, if you talk about it, well, CHIPS Act version 2, like more onshoring, more fabs, building more chips, building more data centers. We know that the incoming administration or the existing administration is thinking a lot about building bigger data centers and helping with the permitting we need for it and the required energy to build these things. As we just discussed throughout this whole episode, turns out compute is important. So building more data centers seems like to be a good thing to be doing here. One can go. And again, I think like actually that's how I expect something like a Manhattan Project or whatever, if you want to call it a joint government project, to look like. The early starters, and these are the early starters we're seeing right now here. It's like first we come together for energy, and then there's like more and more over time. The thing which I just want government not to forget here is let's help our American companies. That's fantastic. But also maybe get something in return. At least I think what we should really make sure is get these model weights secure, get these algorithmic insights secure. There is no need if we like build these things and they can just like be easily be stolen. So like that's also something which I put into my project. Secure data centers, secure model weights, secure the algorithmic insights. And again, while still having innovation as you wanted, Sean.
Yeah, and I think, well, agree with you guys, but one thing I'd like to insert into the discourse is to remind people that like the percentage of foreign-born scientists who were at the Manhattan Project was like over 40%, some like outrageous number. And so if we're going to have a bill which is going to be the AI Manhattan Project, immigration reform has to be somewhere in there. I think it is like, it is still the sort of lowest hanging fruit, easiest thing you can fix, which does not cost any money and will just like lead to more growth and like smarter models and better constructed data centers and better applications and more productivity growth and like more human flourishing, is just to have more of the best brains on the planet working in the US for American companies and making technology great for decades and decades to come. So yes to all the above, and let's throw some more visas to the world's best and brightest in there as well.
And notably, all of these existing AI labs consist, well, I don't know the numbers, but I wouldn't be surprised if half of the leading research teams right now are foreigners. So like one definitely needs to think this through. If you start putting,
I think it's higher.
You think it's higher? Yeah, maybe even higher.
Foreign born. I mean, maybe people have green cards or gotten citizenship at this point, but like I would put 60 to. I wouldn't be surprised with 60 to 70.
Yeah, so it's a key thing to figure out. And also speaking out of my personal interest here as a recent immigrant, I also want to be part of it if we do it, right? So yeah.
Awesome. Well, we'll have the Lennart clause in just for you.
There we go.
Uh,
And now, as promised, Lennart's take on O3, followed by some reading recommendations.
Yeah, happy to share some of the cuff takes on o3 in a similar vein to the recording. So I think all of the points, to my knowledge, and most of the points we discussed, they're still hot because we talked a lot about O1, and this is just like a continuation of this regime. And what we just saw is another crank happening a couple of days later. I think what might be surprising is the leap we've seen. It performs really well on many benchmarks. That's what people pay attention to. That's the only thing we've seen. So notably on the abstract and reasoning corpus for AI, ArcAGI, it's doing 88%. And on the Epoch benchmark Frontier Math, which just came out a couple of months ago, which with like really, really hard math problems, it's already doing 25.2%. These both are really hard benchmarks. Again, especially this Frontier Math for my friends at Epoch. I guess this took many by surprise. I don't want to speak to the details of these benchmarks here and how hard they are, and others. I think others are better equipped in this. Rather, just like some general takeaways from me. It's impressive, right? Just another crank in AI capability ladder. It continues happening. A friend of mine was jokingly saying, "Happy Gary Marcus Day." We previously mostly saw these cranks for each generation of pre-training compute, right? GPT-2, GPT-3 to GPT-4, and this always took a little bit of time. Because the training runs takes time, you need to build these clusters, this takes time. And now we see it quicker. We can iterate faster on this, and as it turns out, it seems to be working well. I think that's exactly what we were talking about in the episode. We will see probably more gains in this test time compute domain. And again, now we've seen within a couple of weeks, couple of months, another crank, which is like as big as we've previously seen with pre-training generations. What matters here, it performs better on stuff the techies think really matters: software engineering and math. Software engineering matters because, well, that's the job of most people that, again, a bunch of people talk about this, but also the people who work on the stuff. That's the job of the people who build the system. So we might not see really this feedback loop going, right, which we touched upon the show. And if I'd be an engineer, what I'd be doing, I'd be using these models. If I'd be an AI company, I'd be using more and more of these models. And interesting enough, if you want to deploy them, they know train your future AI systems, you need more compute for them to run these tasks. We'll see how this plays out. From a governance policy perspective, I'm worried about AI R&D oversight concerns, right? It sounds beautiful to automate everything, but yeah, again, I would call it an oversight concern, right? As we automate more and more of these development processes, we're kind of creating a double risk. We're like first opening door for like potential adversaries to introduce vulnerabilities because we just have less insights there, right? They could just like have sneaky ways to put in certain vectors, which we might not even be understanding, or nobody's even looking at the code anymore, right? And more importantly, we just lose our ability to understand what these systems actually, well, as of right now, actually doing, but also how we're developing. We don't even understand the code anymore we're writing. So do we now want to then deploy these systems which come out of this, like, the iterate feedback loop at scale and deploy them at the Pentagon? I'd be careful here. That's a security issue, right? I will test these systems a lot before I deploy them at scale in critical domains. So much about this AR&D we expect more and more, and I think that's why many people are excited about this, but also worried about it, because again, we just get the flywheel spinning now. What I think is also novel, we saw it really performing well in this ArcAGI price, and it used a lot of inference compute per task. So the more inference compute, the better performed, and that's part of the success here. And interesting enough, on the hard benchmark, it costed around $3,000 for solving the task. To put this into different numbers, if we now assume roughly $1.8 per hour for an H100, that's 1,670 H100 hours. So if you want your response in 5 minutes, you need 20,000 H100s. We talk about like massive clusters here, right? This is like the current generation of clusters. We're building the 100K generation right now. The 20,000 generation is the generation which exists right now. And even for the cheaper one, which is 170 times cheaper, it's still 100 H100s to get your answer in 5 minutes. Again, you can always think longer. You can think for an hour. But again, we have to see how this plays out. And no way of saying this, just like your test score is worse because, well, you thought less, you used less compute. It is, of course, an extremely hard task. And again, does not really always matter. For every task we want to do, this doesn't mean every economic valuable task is like this. And the cost will go down for this because we get more efficient. We learn more about this paradigm. And hardware also gets better, but this general trend is interesting, right? And on the last point, which I would say, maybe this is like an update towards more diffusion. I don't know yet what to make out of it. It's true that this is another leap, and others will get access to it. So I wouldn't be surprised in 2025 many actors maybe even openly release models which catch up on this, right? Using the existing models we have there, maybe the 7B generation or something on these lines, learning how this is being done, really looking deeply into this. Right? That's what every AI researcher right now is doing. This is like their chance to basically relatively compute efficient to get more out of these models. And this means these gaps might continue getting smaller, right? We have like faster iteration time within this new paradigm. And again, as we discussed, there are probably more low-hanging fruits in this test time compute paradigm. And compared to the pre-training approaches, where like it's probably way harder to find these gains. The question for me here is, what does the next generation of pre-training compute get us when leveraging this method? So again, a bigger model, and then we apply this test time compute. And at least for stuff like chain of thought we've seen before, bigger models do better chain of thought. So we have these dual engines running, and they work well together, and we need to kind of wait for the next crank of pre-training compute. And maybe you then see a bigger gap again between the US and China, maybe bigger gap again between the open sourced models and the proprietary models, to be determined. The interesting point here is maybe we move away from like this model per model comparison. Maybe that's actually not the metric we care about here. And it might be more about how many models can you deploy? How many smart tokens can you generate at scale, right? How many AI workers can you deploy? And all of this is, again, a matter of how much compute you have and you can deploy. But anyways, we might see model fusion. We generally will always see model fusion over time. That's just how our technology goes. I think every policymaker should think about this and move a little bit away, or like continue doing all of these measures which are like capability intervening, move more towards like adaptation resilience measures in place. Maybe it's more about my AI versus your AI, and hopefully my AI is smarter and I can deploy more of my AIs because I got more compute. Again, we have to see where this eventually goes, and it's just important to focus more on these resilience and adaptation measures and get more of them going. Anyways, these are some of my takes. Happy holidays, everyone. I bet next year is going to be fun. Buckle up.
So let's close with, I don't know, some reading recommendations for the holidays. Lennart, what was your favorite report of the year?
Given that I just like before the show was tweeting about it and just came out yesterday, Sam Winter-Levy at the Carnegie Endowment just put out something which is called the AI Export Dilemma, 3 Competing Visions for US Strategy, which I think like touches upon the topics we talked about here, just like how should we feel about UAE, what about diffusion, what are the different ways of going about export controls. And again, there will be a revised, I don't think there will be a lot of talk about how we feel about China. We should just continue these export controls. But how do we feel about these swing countries, right? This will be debate, and I think this report covers this. It gives some good ideas, some good things to think about.
Chris, you got a book recommendation, chips related or not? My reading pitch for you guys, it's called The Gunpowder Age, China Military Innovation and the Rise of the West in World History by Tonio Andrade. We're going to be doing a show Q1 2025. Incredibly fun book. Like, there is a real deficit of Chinese military history, and this is a particularly fun angle. Like, Tonio goes really deep into the Chinese sources, but basically it is an argument about the Great Divergence through the lens of gunpowder and, cannons and guns, and like using the sort of like very like weird battles that happened between the Ming and Qing and like the Portuguese and the British and the Russians as sort of like case studies and points in time to benchmark just where China was from a sort of scientific innovation perspective over the course of the Industrial Revolution. And he makes the case which, Yasheng Huang, the guest that we did, epic 2-hour podcast with over the summer, that actually the divergence happened much later, and that into the 1500s and even 1600s, China was basically on par from a sort of military innovation perspective with the best of what the West could bring from a like boat making and cannon making and gun making perspective. And there's like a lot of flair in it too. It's just like written with a lot of verve and having, I don't know, there's too much like dead history writing out there, and to find someone who's doing like a big sweep of history that's like military history and technology and US and sort of like China and the rest of the world comparisons just like hits every single one of my sweet spots. So alongside your AI trilemma, the Gunpowder Age. All right, Chris, what do you got for us?
All right, I got even deeper history for you. Max Bennett's A Brief History of Intelligence, which is a history of brains as they've evolved over like the last million years, going back to the first neurons. It's an extraordinary book written by a guy who's an AI expert, and he got interested in how intelligence evolved and became a neuroscience expert in the process. It is a great read, more fun than I expected, and really thought-provoking about the history of how beings of all sorts, including humans, think.
Lennart, Chris, thanks so much for being a part of ChinaTalk, and have a happy New Year.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
向前。